Think of your favorite slasher film. The formula is almost certainly the same. A silent, masked predator stalks a secluded lover's lane, violently punishing teenagers for a moment of intimacy. We tend to view these elements as pure fiction, engineered in Hollywood writers' rooms to guarantee box office returns. But those specific cinematic signatures weren't invented by a screenwriter. They were pulled directly from the real-world forensic files of an unsolved string of murders in 1946. To understand where the modern movie monster actually comes from, we have to look at how a bureaucratic failure in a divided border town allowed a very real human predator to hunt without consequence. In early 1946, the twin city of Texarkana was navigating a difficult transition. During World War II, the region surged in population, employing over 20,000 workers for military ammunition production. Now, the town had to shift back to a peacetime economy. The streets were flooded with transient defense laborers and soldiers returning from the Pacific and Europe. Many of these veterans carried severe combat trauma, then categorized as battle fatigue, but largely untreated. Standard rural hunting practices combined with war souvenirs meant civilian gun ownership was exceptionally high. The community was fiercely protective, tense, and constantly on guard. A town crowded with transient strangers, armed citizens, and silent psychological trauma provided the exact camouflage an organized predator needed to operate unnoticed. Texarkana sits on a unique geographic fault line. It is a twin city, bisected cleanly down the middle by State Line Avenue. The eastern half is in Arkansas, and the western half is in Texas. In 1946, the two police departments operated on completely different radio frequencies. They could not transmit across the street. If a crime occurred on the Texas side and the suspect crossed into Arkansas, Texas officers had to find a landline telephone, call the Arkansas desk sergeant, and wait for them to manually dispatch a vehicle. Even if an arrest was made, extradition laws at the time required formal governor-level paperwork simply to transfer a suspect from one side of town to the other for questioning. The killer recognized this administrative blind spot. By targeting rural roads along the county margins, he could commit a crime and slip across the border while detectives were still arguing over who had primary authority. The first confirmed attacks targeted young couples parked on secluded lovers' lanes, including Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry. During this assault, Larry provided the only survivor description of the killer's disguise, a crude white cloth sack with asymmetric eye holes. This chart plots the dates of the initial attacks against the lunar cycle. The dates neatly align with the new moon phase, a period of zero illumination. The killer intentionally struck during these nights, using absolute darkness to mask his approach along the isolated roads. But 2 months later, the pattern shifts. The killer attacked Virgil and Katie Starks inside their own farmhouse, firing directly through a closed window screen. This attack occurred precisely during a full moon. He needed the high ambient light to see his targets clearly from the dark tree line without using a flashlight. The killer also exhibited a classic serial signature during the murders of Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker. Booker was a high school saxophonist. After killing her, the attackers stole her gold-lacquered instrument in its velvet-lined case, taking it as a permanent trophy. These forensic details remove the idea of a chaotic monster. This was an organized, highly local outdoorsman who calculated lighting conditions, managed his crime scenes, and actively collected mementos. To break the bureaucratic deadlock between the two states, the governors brought in Texas Ranger Captain Manuel Lone Wolf Gonzalez. He established a joint headquarters and immediately took total operational command. Gonzalez quickly realized that standard police cruisers were useless. The heavy engine noise on gravel roads gave the killer ample warning to retreat into the deep woods before a spotlight ever reached the scene. So he initiated a radical undercover operation. He placed young, athletic rangers and female volunteers in civilian cars, parking them deep in the targeted lovers' lanes. With the dome lights disconnected, they sat in pitch-black silence for 8 hours a night, armed with hidden, sawn-off 12-gauge shotguns, waiting for a flashlight beam to hit their windows. The decoy teams never engaged in a direct firefight, likely because the killer's intimate knowledge of the terrain allowed him to spot the traps. However, the sheer lethality of the operation neutralized his hunting grounds, abruptly ending his access to parked cars. The investigation eventually focused on a 39-year-old career car thief named UL Swinney. Physically, Swinney was an exact match for the worn-down tire treads and muddy footprints left behind at the Starks farmhouse. The case against him hardened when his wife, Peggy Swinney, gave investigators a multi-page confession. She stated her husband was the killer and provided highly accurate, unpublicized forensic details, including the exact culvert where he had hidden Betty Jo Booker's missing saxophone. Despite this breakthrough, prosecutors hit an absolute wall. Under the strict spousal privilege laws of 1946, a wife's testimony was completely inadmissible in a capital murder trial unless she was an active co-conspirator. Investigators never recovered that .32 caliber murder weapon. Without the physical gun to corroborate Peggy's claims, the rigid legal architecture of the era made it impossible to secure a murder indictment. Gonzalez pivoted, securing a conviction against Swinney under habitual car theft statutes, which carried a life sentence. The moment Swinney entered the Texas State Penitentiary, the phantom attacks stopped forever. Because no one ever stood trial for the homicides, the public never saw a definitive culprit behind bars. The killer remained a faceless, invincible specter in the public imagination. The terror in Texarkana relied on geography, radio frequencies, and divided police jurisdictions. But because the law couldn't officially close the case, the Phantom bypassed a standard prison sentence and stepped directly into folklore, supplying the exact forensic blueprint for decades of American horror.